Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. It's time for China and Europe to rise above their differences and find creative solutions to solve global problems like climate change and poverty. That was the message from Li Qiang at the end of his first overseas visit since becoming Chinese premier earlier this year. He visited Germany and France to talk trade, development and, of course, decoupling.
We unequivocally oppose trade protectionism and all forms of decoupling and severing of supply chains. The security and stability of the global industrial supply must be maintained. At the same time, it's necessary to further expand industrial and investment cooperation to encourage multinational companies and large enterprises to invest more directly in developing countries.
Joining me now from Paris is Gérard Araud, former permanent representative of France to the United Nations. And in Berlin is Sevim Dağdelen, member of the German Bundestag and deputy chairwoman of the German-Chinese Parliamentary Friendship Group. Thank you both for coming on the agenda. Now, Sevim, I'll start with you. De-risking, decoupling, these have been the buzzwords, haven't they, of this visit. Premier Li was quite critical of the EU's call for de-risking supply chains. He said, you depend on me and I depend on you, when he was at a dinner in Paris. I mean, how might this face-to-face conversation and meetings that he's been having in Europe change the relationship between China and Europe?
Well, first of all, Premier Li is right to point out the close economic ties between China and the European Union. So the volume of trade between European Union and China is around 700 billion euros. And China is the European Union's most important trading partner. The European Union and China therefore have a common interest in good economic relations. And Premier Li's statement is, of course, flattering towards the European Union. After all, the European Union's dependence on imports from China, with a share of over 22%, is much higher than China's dependence on the European Union, with an import share of just about 10%. So worsening trade relations, which would inevitably be the result of the strategy currently being prepared by the European Commission, would therefore harm the European Union member states disproportionately more than China. And China has risen in a very short time to become the world's second largest economy and one of the most important diverse drivers of technology and innovation. So I find it extremely worrying that currently in Europe, under the cover of so-called de-risking, there is an increasing focus on a controlled decoupling, actually.
Gérard, is that how you see things from the French perspective?
First, let's be frank. Of course, the Europeans are closer to the United States than to China. We have democratic values in common and we have a common history. But, and that's very important, at the same time, of course, China is not an enemy. China is a partner, China is a competitor, and we have, in a sense, to set the terms of this competition. And the terms of this competition really have changed with the COVID. You know, the COVID crisis has shown that we were depending on international trade in some areas, and like for a power like the European Union, it's not really, it's a problem. It's a real problem. So we have to find the right balance between cooperating, trading with China, and with the United States, by the way, but also we have to not to depend too much on our competitors and on China in these terms. So that's the meaning of de-risking. But you know, China is de-risking on its side. The United States are de-risking on their side. You know, the COVID crisis has shown that globalization has also negative aspects. we, the Europeans, suddenly we discovered that we couldn't get mask, really the simple thing as a mask, because everything was coming from China. And it's the same thing with the medicine. So that's nearly, in a sense, an adaptation of the new reality of the world. We have to work with our competitor, and China is not an enemy, but a competitor.
Sevim, Premier Li went to Germany to talk about trade, to talk about climate action, to talk about Ukraine. And he talked very much of the importance of carrying forward the traditional friendship with Germany. What does that mean to you?
First of all, it is a really great sign of hope that with the visit of Premier Li and the 100-headed delegation from China, the direct German-Chinese government consultations have taken place again for the first time in 5 years. What is needed is not less, but more cooperation with China, not only economically and politically, but also in science and culture. We have deep, deep relations in science and culture with China. Chancellor Olaf Scholz should put an end to the really sometimes chaotic discussions in his own coalition, in his own government, and finally pursue a clear policy in the interest of the German population. So we must do everything possible to ensure that the forces of reason prevail over those who want to play political roulette and work toward destroying the German-Chinese relations.
It's interesting, you're talking about the real importance there of cooperation, and you highlighted that economic cooperation is somewhere where things are moving forward. So I'd like to bring you in, Gérard, because in Paris, ahead of the summit on the new global financing pact, Li attended a signing ceremony of a non-binding agreement between Airbus and China aviation industry partners. So these business deals are really quite significant, aren't they? I wonder what you think deals like that mean for China's relationship with France and with other EU nations.
The world is a small village. The world is a globalized village. And as I have said, it's obvious that China, the European Union, the United States, and the rest of the world have to work together. And this agreement between Airbus, which is not a French company, which is a European company, where Germany is playing a big role, and China is, of course, a positive element. We don't have to talk in sort of two terms possible, confrontation or cooperation. There is also competition. We are competitors. We have to accept it, and we have to manage it together. So that's the reason why the visit, and I do agree with Madame Dağdelen, is what is very important is to have a dialogue, a political dialogue. So the visit of Prime Minister Li is critical, and we should have a lot of these types of visits.
Somewhere where there might be some positive cooperation as a direct result of this visit might be action on climate change, because that was very much a key focus of the discussion. The slogan, after all, was acting sustainably together. So, Sevim, where do you see China and Germany working more closely together in this area? I mean, Germany used, of course, to be the global leader in solar power equipment, a mantle which has now been passed to China.
First of all, I just want to say something about Mr. Araud's statement. The thing is, of course, in a globalized world, not everything is easy. But the problem is the West is approaching now to deglobalize. And that's the problem, what we are facing at the moment. And as you mentioned, the solar and the solar power equipment, it is not China, first of all, that is responsible for the destruction of the German solar industry, which is mentioned sometimes by some German politician. But it is the German government of Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, with its cutbacks in subsidies, which incidentally have also cost around 100,000 jobs in the solar industry in Germany. So in 2010, the German solar industry was still a global leader. And today, the German government is even letting go of the only major solar cell manufacturer in Europe. This is the company called Meyer Burger, a Swiss solar company with production site in Saxony-Anhalt, so it's in the east of Germany, which is expanding its production now to the United States as a result of the economic war against Russia and US subsidies. So in the area of sustainable industrial policy, there is a great need and great potential for cooperation with China, which focuses on climate change and maintains production capacity in this country.
We're talking about that need for cooperation with China. Premier Li told business leaders that was the biggest risk to the future, a lack of cooperation. So how much of a concern and how likely is that, Gérard?
You know, it's what is the difference that we have with the Cold War between USSR and the US is, and you're right to refer to climate change, we have global concerns which are really very global. I think the United States, Europeans, Africa, China, we are all really facing the same challenge, climate change. So it's a good example where the Europeans, you know, could be a sort of go-between between the United States and China by really, in a sense, pushing forward a bold agenda on climate change. But there are other issues which are issues of concerns for the humankind, beyond China, beyond the US, beyond Europe, where we should work together. And again, Europeans in a sense, between the US and China could be a bridge to avoid this confrontation to become dangerous. We could work on the future of oceans. We could work together on the problem of cryptocurrencies, about terrorism, and a lot of issues. So again, the Europeans, we have a specific voice, and we have specific concerns. And as I have said, we are very close to the Americans. We are talking to the Chinese. We should, in a sense, defend our values and defend our particular vision of the world. There is a European voice, and it should be heard in Washington, D.C., and it should be heard in Beijing.
Gérard Araud, Sevim Dağdelen, it's been great talking to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
As well as talking trade and future cooperation with France and Germany, Premier Li Qiang also attended President Macron's Global Financing Pact Summit, where again, his message couldn't have been clearer.
China and Europe should rise above their differences, seek and expand common ground while respecting differences, and push for more creative solutions to tackle the uncertainty in the global situation, with the stability of Chinese-European relations, and jointly contribute to the sustainable development of the human race.
Joining me now is economist and director of Columbia University's Center for Sustainable Development, Jeffrey Sachs, and Zhiguang Yin, professor in international politics at Fudan University in Shanghai. Gentlemen, great to see both of you. Thanks for coming back on the agenda. Jeffrey, let me start with you, because you're in Paris at the new Global Financial Pact meeting. So how important was it that Premier Li Qiang was there, and what do you make of what he had to say?
I think it was very important that he was there. Certainly, the African leadership appreciated it. The Latin American leaders that were at the meeting appreciated it. And the Premier spoke about the need for global cooperation to really get the job done of making the energy transformation and ending extreme poverty. And since China has so much to contribute to this global effort. In fact, it's going to be absolutely key to it. I think it was extremely good that the Premier was here, and I thought his remarks were very strong.
President Macron launched the summit with calls for a public finance shock to ensure that no country should have to choose between tackling poverty and dealing with climate change. So is that what's needed? And what's it going to take to make it happen, Jeffrey?
The shock is needed. The problem really is the United States government doesn't want to contribute. So the U.S. is looking for all sorts of shortcuts, asking the international development banks like the World Bank to find more out of their current balance sheets rather than putting more resources from the U.S. government and the other rich countries into these banks. So I'm still waiting to see, is this talk and gimmick or is this something new? So far, we haven't seen real money on the table. We heard a lot of commitments, the need to move from talk to action, the need to walk the walk. But I know what's happening in U.S. politics, which is that our system is designed to really protect the rich against any kind of claims. And that's what's happening right now. That's why the role of China as a major contributor to the global system through the Belt and Road Initiative and other ways is so really very important right now.
Professor Yin, China is still a developing nation. So how important do you think it was that Li Qiang attended the meeting in person? And what do you think it says about China's approach to poverty, but also to climate change?
Right. I think it is of vital importance that China attended this meeting as a developing country, since in the past couple of decades, the developing country's voice has largely been ignored in this largely hierarchical world order. And by being there as a representative of the developing country, China could bring in the developing country's experience of countering the extreme poverty and climate change without having to jeopardize other countries' interests.
Geopolitical tensions are increasing. Are we going to see more de-risking rather than decoupling, or are these two really the same things, just under different names?
Frankly, this discussion of de-risking or decoupling is a lot of gobbledygook. The question is whether we're going to have decent, normal relations with Europe, China, and the United States, or whether there's going to be conflict. The United States is afraid of China's rise. It has become quite hostile to China's rise. I think that this is absurd. China's economic development is in America's interest as well as China's interest, obviously, and world interest. So I think it's a win-win proposition. When you're an economist, you believe in win-win. That prosperity is good for everybody. When you are a geopolitical strategist, you believe win-lose. If China advances, that's bad for the U.S. So I think all this talk about de-risking and decoupling is kind of the word language of the geostrategists, who I don't much agree with on anything. Economists don't use this kind of language, or shouldn't. We should have trade. We should have interdependence. We should, in the United States, we should champion China's rise because that's good. We should be glad when China makes technological advances. That's what lowered the cost of renewable energy so dramatically for the world. So I hope that we move beyond the conflicts, end the war in Ukraine, have decent relations between the U.S. and China. Then we would really have the basis for making progress on climate change and many other issues.
Professor Yin, I can see you nodding away there. So do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm more on the geopolitical side, but I completely agree with the opinion that geopolitics seems to look at the world as if this is an absolute win and an absolute lose perspective. But in reality, especially through the Chinese recent years' development, we could see that the win-win situation is possible. And also, I want to emphasize that the Chinese experience by by developing through cooperation, it really provides a new perspective in understanding how development should work. Especially, development should be with the greater majority of the people.
What I want to ask you, Professor Yin, is about this creative solution notion, the creative solutions to global problems. That's something that Premier Li spoke about. What do you think we're talking about here?
Well, I think Premier Li taps into a long history, not necessarily long, but 70 years history of the People's Republic of China had gained its development has developed out of its semi-colonial and colonial status through self-reliance, but at the same time through mutual aid with other developing countries in the global south. And I think developing through cooperation, a state-driven development, and the state-driven development, particularly with a focus on the best interest of the people, are crucial in understanding the Chinese developmental experience. And no one else, apart from the states, would be able to offer, for example, mass education program to empower the people and to counter extreme poverty.
Jeffrey Sachs, the Premier's visit to Europe came hot on the heels of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to Beijing. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that the US and China have a responsibility to work together. Now, what, if anything, has changed in terms of the rest of the world's attitude to China over the past week? Are we in a better place now?
I think what happened starting around 2015 is that the American political leadership became afraid of China's further rise, and a lot of crises were stoked. And actually, the Americans made a kind of game plan. Let's make trade arrangements in Asia that don't include China, which is a little silly in my view because China is the major trading country of Asia. And let's start export bans on high technology, and let's put on unilateral trade barriers and stop financial flows and attack Huawei and force TikTok to divest, many things. You know, I think the rest of the world is really very uneasy about this. I travel all over the world, and I would say leaders everywhere say, don't make us choose between the US and China. We want normal relations with both. And this is a correct point of view, and it's absolutely still possible. It's in the US, there is a political fight between the so-called neoconservatives who believe in US hegemony, and I would say normal people who believe that this is a big world and a multipolar world. And so we don't have this settled in the US. It's not settled in the world. That's why it's really worth the effort to just calm down the tensions, lower the tensions, talk with each other, because so much of the tensions were deliberately provoked by the United States because of this growing fear. But I don't think we should have that fear, frankly. I don't see any reason for the fear. I think we should aim for a cooperative global environment.
So let's talk a little bit more about that multipolar concept. Professor Yin, I mean, in the light of Premier Li's visit, do you think that Europe has become increasingly dependent on China? I'm thinking about things like green energy.
Sure, but first of all, I think it is the word dependent is slightly misleading. I would rather prefer to use the word mutual reliance, and also the term multipolar is also misleading, and instead I myself, and of course China's in their 20th National Congress report, would use multilateral, because the world as polarized is extremely dangerous, as if it assumes that the world is controlled by a handful of big powers that makes the call, whereas only the opinions of the big powers that matters. And this leads to my first point of using mutual reliance rather than dependent. Mutual reliance suggests that we all need each other, but the reality is, I mean, human society, we all need each other. Nobody could be truly atomized individual that lives in a bubble and completely makes the call all by itself. So in this sense, I would say the softer, would you say that as the softer approach of the EU is very welcoming, and also it is inevitable.
Trade has very much been top of the agenda on Li Qiang's European visit. But the Wall Street Journal reports a new poll showing that European business confidence in China has fallen to a record low, with more companies pulling back on investments amid all the geopolitical tensions and the country's sluggish economy. What's it going to take to change that?
Well, first, I think the Wall Street Journal article is referring mainly to U.S. companies, and mainly U.S. companies that are hearing this geopolitical drumbeat from Washington. So I don't think it is the same in Europe, and it certainly is not the same in the rest of the world. My own view is, first of all, I want to agree with Professor Yin that we say dependence. It's a funny idea. We used to say trade, that you buy some things, you sell some things. Now we call it dependence. If you buy some things from somebody else, this is the wrong way of understanding it. Dependency is a very tendentious word. Mutual reliance, fine. I would say international trade works well for both sides of the trade arrangement. But one of the things that was so key for China's success over the last 40 years was its great export competitiveness. And China remains today the low-cost producer of major infrastructure in the world and the low-cost producer of a lot of the renewable energy technologies. I very much like the Belt and Road Initiative, in which China helps to finance major increases of infrastructure in the neighbors in ASEAN region or in Africa or Latin America. I think this is a great program. It increases China's exports. It enables China's excellent low-cost technologies to reach more of the world. And at this global summit, at the end of the summit, it was fascinating. The African leaders said, we have a crucial infrastructure project, which is a major hydropower project in the center of Africa called the Grand Inga. They said, that's our most important project. And all I could think, as they were saying, is China knows how to do such projects. So I think that there's really great opportunities here for China's economy in a win-win with developing countries. So this, I think, is a very important reality in our global marketplace.
Professor Yin, Jeffrey Sachs, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.